And then I'm going to start the webinar and give it a few seconds as folks roll in. So here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Those of you that are just joining us, we'll get started in just a few seconds. We're just waiting for people to hop on. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our Q&A session regarding the Upper Lake study at Durant Nature Preserve. My name is Amy Eckberg. I am the park manager at Durant Nature Preserve, and I'll be serving as our meeting host. I'm joined by my colleagues, Michael G., who will be providing some technical assistance to us this evening, and Christy Moyer, who will help moderate our Q&A portion of our meeting. We have 3 speakers this evening who will be doing short presentations to provide some background information in regards to why we are here this evening and the results of the Upper Lake study that was done. First, we'll hear from Brian Smith, the City of Raleigh's Natural Resources Administrator with the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department, who will put the project in context for us by providing an overview of the existing Upper Lake condition, which led us to undertake a study to explore our options. Next, we'll hear from Kevin Boyer from the City of Raleigh Stormwater Division, who will speak to us about stormwater's role in this project, the feasibility study grant, and the City of Raleigh's lake policy. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Barbara Dahl, Extension Assistant Professor with the NCC grant, NC State's Bio and Ag Engineering Department. Barbara will speak to us about the study in more detail and the options that were proposed for the city to consider. After the presentations, Michael will hop back on real quick to provide us some more information about how to participate in the Q&A session. However, please feel free to type your questions into the chat, as Christy will be monitoring them during the presentations so that we can address them immediately afterwards. Thank you for your participation tonight and for your interest in Durant Nature Preserve. We are so pleased that you're here. Brian, are you ready to kick us off?
I believe so. Thank you very much for the intro, Amy. A quick check-in from Mike just to make sure that folks can see my screen. As far as you know, Mike, are we sharing and are we good to go?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And thank you both to Councilman Cox and Councilman Buckin for joining us and for the rest of the night. We're excited to be able to share some information with you about the opportunities and options that we have for the Upper Lake and Durant Nature. So go through and outline, as Amy said, we've got a couple of things to cover here. The basics of why we are here, what we know so far from what we've studied, and what we're going to do next. And look at what we have here in the outline, as well as an image that I included there on the lower right to essentially give us an idea of one of the things that kicked off all of the things that you're going to hear about back in 2006 in Tropical Storm Alberto. This is some of the runoff that was coming over the dam, actually at Lake Johnson, so not at Durant, but at Lake Johnson through the spillway there, which actually led to some emergency repairs at that dam. And that same system indicated the city that given there was emergency repairs needed there, we also needed to look at many other dams across the city. So in 2013, there was a study done to do just that, to look at a bunch of the part of the information that we're looking at tonight is coming from that initial study. We'll hear a little bit more in detail about these from both Dr. Dahl and Kevin Boyer. But the 2013 report that looked at both of the dams at Durant Lake indicated that this dam on the lower lake was a little steep. It was already getting animal burrows in it, so it was mined in some areas. The spillway on the dam had some gaps underneath it, and it was deemed that this was structurally deficient in maintenance. And we'll hear more about what the specific issues are for the upper dam also in this. The repairs have been made on the lower dam. And any of you that are regular users of Durant are aware that the lower lake needed to be drained in order for us to do that work. And this side of near the lake side of the dam, we added alternating concrete block to reinforce it on the front, and then replanted the back of the dam after regrading it and fixing the spillway as well. And one of the things that we did here is planted the back of the dam into native prairie species, native to North Carolina, and people are getting a lot of enjoyment out of that. And that's part in keeping with the designation of Durant as a nature. So it's one of the things that we wanted to do, and it's in keeping with what we're trying to go through in terms of a process for the upper dam. The other thing I mentioned here is we did a couple of things like the mesh that was used for erosion control on the back of the dam as this seed was actually germinating. We departed from what you would normally see at a lot of construction sites in a plastic mesh that's put down. And this is a natural fiber product that does a much better job not trapping snakes and other amphibians or snakes and amphibians once you put it down. So that was one of the things that we did that worked fairly well. And what I'd like to do at this point is just back up a second and talk about what is a nature preserve and where did that come from, and do we actually understand what that designation is that Durant carries. Durant's one of 4 properties that have a nature preserve designation across the city, and that came from a report that was done with a task force in 2011. And the definition that that task force came up with, the request of city council, was to find sites that exemplify high quality plant and animal populations and communities, sites that contribute to biodiversity and environmental health, sites that would protect and manage those significant natural resources. And where compatible with these top 3 bullets, the 4th thing would be that you'd have opportunities for public enjoyment of those natural recreation, environmental education. So if you look at the map of Durant and as it currently sits, one of the things that's been done for years is to focus more of the active use at Durant on this side of the park. And where the upper lake is on this side of the park, it's a little less activated. We use this more as a wildlife refuge for years and want to continue to do that. One of the things then that means for this practice or for this particular meeting and this discussion is we know now that this upper lake needs to be repaired, the dam and the infrastructure associated. So knowing that, what's the best way forward in order to honor the resource that we have and the designation that we have on it? So one of the things that any good scientist does is say, well, it'd be good to have more data and more information. And we started talking about it and realizing that we really need to understand what's possible in the upper lake. And that's exactly what this study did, or what we went into in terms of doing a study. I'm going to hand it to Kevin Boyer at this point to talk a little bit more about that. And then Dr. Dahl will follow up and actually give you details out of the study. So Kevin, I'll hand it to you to talk about the role of Raleigh stormwater.
Thank you, Brian. Brian or Mike, would you verify you can hear me?
Yeah.
We got you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll be speaking briefly about the role of Raleigh Stormwater Management Division generally and in this project. But broadly speaking, stormwater management takes responsibility and charge for drainage on public rights of way and other public places within the city, also reducing pollution in our stormwater runoff and mitigating floods and flood damage where we can and have authority to do so. part of what we do, in addition to that, is to monitor the condition and function of city-owned and city-operated dams and spillways. And we, when needed, repair and upgrade those dams and spillways. That includes evaluating their conditions and setting priorities for dams and spillways that do need work. When needed, we manage, design, get the permits, and manage the construction of repairs and upgrades. And then once that's done, we, and for dams and lakes that do not need any work, we generally manage the operation and maintenance of the dams and spillways that are on city property and in designated public easements. Next slide, please. Specific to the Upper Lake at Durant Nature Preserve, city stormwater applied for and managed a grant from the North Carolina Clean Water Management Trust Fund to study conditions and look at alternatives. We also provided city stormwater funds to augment the grant funds, and then we contracted with and coordinated the work of North Carolina State University to study the lake in conjunction with our preserve staff and other city departments. You'll hear shortly from Dr. Barbara Dahl about that. Next slide, please. Also under the city stormwater's charge is what we're calling the city lake policy. It began in 1994 and then was called the Lake Preservation Policy. And at that time, the primary purpose of the policy was to work toward preserving Raleigh's existing lakes to the mutual benefit of the city, citizens, and the lake's owners. That is, the focus was on preservation at that time. There was not lots of activity under that policy. And then in 2004, the city began a stormwater utility where we have a fee paid into the utility by property owners that then gave us a regular stream of revenue for which we could plan projects, including projects on lakes and dams and spillways. And the policy was updated in 2006, adding flexibility to the old policy by giving us the flexibility to consider lake location and drainage basin rather than a one-size-fits-all policy for the whole city. Next slide, please. Continuing on the policy, it was recently revised another time, starting in really 2018 and then into 2020. It's now being called the Lake Management Policy. Now priorities are based on public and environmental benefits. Flexibility, additional flexibility added to the policy includes being able to choose the best course of action for an existing lake, which often will be lake preservation, but it allows us to also consider stream restoration or converting the lake to a stream, a more natural flowing stream, or creating wetlands, or some combinations or other alternatives that haven't mentioned here. It also added a process for public involvement and input. This meeting is part of that public information and input process. We'll also have meetings with the City Parks Board and the Stormwater Management Advisory Commission and possibly an additional public meeting just about this project. The revised policy also added a process for actions by our Stormwater Management Advisory Commission for any changes being made to city-owned or operated lakes, and action by the City Council for any action that would change the lake from its present condition as a lake into something other than a lake. Next slide, please. Before turning over to Dr. Dahl, I would like to mention the timeline of funding that we have for this project. The We applied for the grant, this Clean Water Management Trust Fund grant in 2017. We were awarded the grant later in that year. Through January of 2020, about a year ago, we conducted and completed the study and report. And now we're in transition into selecting the alternative to be implemented, to be followed by design and construction on a timeline in the next several years, but to be determined. Funding we've brought to the project so far includes the $127,400 from Clean Water Management Trust Fund, $54,600 contributed to match that by city stormwater funds. We have budgeted and have gotten and have approval from City Council for $350,000 for design for the alternative that ultimately is selected. And we are including in our budget for a year or several years out, $2.5 million for further design and construction on the selected alternative. And with that, I will turn over to Barbara Dahl. Thank you.
Great. It's good to be with everyone tonight. I'll just share my screen and then, all right, so my slides, can you see those? Kevin, is everything up?
I see your slides.
Okay, great. And I just want to mention that I work with a team of engineers, so the work I'm presenting is not all myself. I do have 3 other engineers that worked on this effort. Jack Kirky Fox, he's with us tonight. Jonathan Page and Dan Line also assisted with this. As Kevin said, we were contracted to kind of develop and look at some different alternatives for the upper Durant Lake with the kind of goals in mind of trying to diversify ecological habitat, improve water quality, potentially expand the environmental education opportunities, and really to come up with some ideas that would ensure long-term viability of the upper lake. For our work, we did a number of things. We had a number of steps to complete ahead of that kind of design process. First, we had to survey the topography or elevations out there and the lake bathymetry, getting the kind of depths and the sediment in the bottom of the lake, what levels they were at. We did some evaluation of the land use change in the watershed or the land area that drains into that lake. We monitored and evaluated the water quality. We sampled for aquatic life, focusing on macroinvertebrates, which are insects that start their life in the stream and are good indicators of health and water quality. We quantified and evaluated the sediments in the bottom of the lake, and we conducted hydrologic modeling to look at when larger storm comes, big rainfalls, kind of the flows that move into and out of the lake. And then after completing that, we developed and evaluated several concept designs for repairing or retrofitting the upper lake. Looking at the land use, we've got an image from 1992 up at the top here. Did this not advance? Okay, there it goes. Okay. Looking at the land use, we've got the top image here shows 1992. We've got a bottom image here from 2017. And we can see that we've had quite a bit of land use change and developed. We had a big increase over that time and a big loss of forests, especially along this kind of southwest portion of that watershed. The blue line is the drainage area or the watershed, and then the red outline there and the bottom right is the lake itself. So a lot of that change occurred between 92 and 2001, and things have been pretty stable since 2001. So if we look at the kind of existing situation or existing condition of the lake, we have several things to consider. We've got a damaged outlet structure here. This was identified in the earlier study that Brian referred to. We have a damaged spillway. It has some problems. It cracks in this concrete exposure. It's very undermined at the bottom end of it. And there's a lot of erosion. So you can really see how much that exposed that spillway is at the bottom end. We have a moderate amount of sediment that has accumulated in the lake over time. The survey we did estimated around 12,500 cubic yards, and that's resulted in a loss of about 20% of the storage capacity of the lake, with a lot of that sediment occurring at the upper end of the lake. So also looking at the other site assessment results, we found that the accumulated sediment was not hazardous. There was not any kind of contaminants there that would be of concern for that material. The existing and dam and the spillway really provide little flood control benefit. All of our modeling of the hydrology showed that. They just really didn't shave off any of the high peak flows that can occur when we get very large storms. The lake does provide moderate water quality benefits. We did that kind of upstream, downstream sampling in the creek above and below, and finding that it removes some nitrate, nitrogen, some phosphorus, and some sediment. And we found that the habitat above the lake and the stream was very limited, with a poor to fair bioclassification. Again, we looked at aquatic insects, and here's an example of that, stonefly. These are invertebrates, insects that start their life in the water and then emerge from that. And they're good indicators of stream health. So with that information, we then set out to look at the 4 design alternatives. The first alternative is to keep the lake as is, repair or replace the existing structure there. We looked at 2 kind of wetland versions. They're fairly similar. There's some kind of minor differences between those. And then finally, the last option we looked at was returning it to a stream restoration, where we'd breach the dam, kind of restore a channel there that would mimic a natural stream, and with some wetland system in the floodplain combined. So I'm just going to quickly kind of review the 4 examples, show you some of the highlights from that. The report we have is much more detailed. For the lake as is, what that would include is to install a new spillway, because as I showed, that's very damaged and would actually have to have a new weir at the top of it. A new outlet structure here out more towards the middle of the dam. And we would put in some grade control structures, because we have some eroding channels that are draining into the lake. And when you've got this type of erosion downward and widening, this causes a lot of sediment to get into the lake. So it'd be very important to kind of prevent some of that further down erosion of these creeks, and prevent some of that sediment to getting in, and then also to remove a portion of that sediment at the upstream part of the lake. So the first stormwater wetland design we have includes some shallow water areas where you would have lots of emergent plants that are going to help with water quality. They're going to also provide some habitat. And then we'd have some deep water zones that could have some fish in them, also allow for some settling of sediment in that. It would be this wetland design. We have quite a bit of slope. It's about a 1.5% slope across this valley. So we have to step that down. So this wetland approach had 3 berms with weirs to step it down about 2 foot on each step down to the bottom. So then the water flows through the weirs, and it's a labyrinth type weir like this on the bottom right that we recommended for that. We would also have to still replace that spillway outlet, and we showed lowering the dam a few feet in height with that, and that would alleviate some of the drop as well on the spillway to lower that down. The habitat wetland, as we called it, also has shallow water areas and deep water pools similar to the previous wetland example. However, with the berming, we looked at stepping it down much more at the earlier part of the wetland, so you could have a larger contiguous kind of wetland area here. It would still require a new spillway and lowering the dam by a few feet. The final alternative we looked at is stream restoration, where we'd convert that area back to a channel and floodplain, again, mimicking what we would see in the natural environment, maybe somewhat similar to what might have been there before this area was impounded by the dam. And so we would have this channel and a floodplain here, and we would build riffle pool features in the bottom of that channel for habitat. And we would have to have a number of grade control structures because, as I said, it drops down in elevation about a 1.5% slope. So you would have a number of these structures created from large boulders that create a series of steps down the channel. You would have a wide floodplain that would get planted. Here's showing one with new vegetation, but you would want trees eventually to grow there. And we would showed incorporating floodplain wetlands out here, are kind of pockets and pools that would provide habitat for amphibians. Because again, remember, some of the goal was to diversify the ecological habitat that's there. We would lower the dam much more than before to really kind of reduce that whole big impoundment effect, because this would operate more as a stream and a floodplain. All right, so to kind of compare the different approaches, we use something called MultiCriteria decision analysis. This is a tool that's used to guide complex decisions, and it helps you by dividing those decisions into understandable small parts. You analyze each part, and then you integrate those parts to kind of look at what a meaningful solution might be. So for our MCDA analysis, you first set up these design criteria. So these are things that are important for us to gauge the value of each project on. And we worked with the city of Raleigh to come up with what these items are. We have 8 of those items, including water quality, flood control, habitat enhancement, the educational or interpretive opportunities, potential risk to the downstream lake, project implementation time, or how long it takes to get it built and done, how much you've got to spend, and then what's the ongoing maintenance costs. And so we have pretty rough estimates of the maintenance cost, but reasonable estimates of the investment or capital cost to build that. So then there's a weighting factor that's assigned to each of these categories, and the city decided those weights. So you can see that the higher number goes to the risk to the downstream lake. It gets a 4. That was most important because a lot of investment's been made in repairing that, and it would be very bad to have some type of negative impact or a breach of the downstream lake as well, because that could cause devastating flooding downstream. So that's the high. So you can see which items were rated more significantly or had a higher rank than the other items. So then each project, each design alternative is rated on each individual factor here and given a score. And NC State, we performed that ranking. So actually looking at the costs we estimated, resulted in that score, our modeling. So we tried to have as much quantitative information to base that on. And so what you can see is that the top score, a higher number means a higher score means it's ranked higher, is that the habitat wetland here gets the highest score at 59. So it's ranked the #1 choice. And then the stormwater wetland is #2, and the lake as is 3, and then the stream restoration as 4. And so we do have that report. I'm not going to go through all the reasons why the scores are higher and low, but that is discussed in the report, and we're happy to share that with you. That's all I have. I will stop sharing, and then we can open it. I'll turn it back over to Amy, and then we'll have time for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Barbara, Brian, and Kevin, for those awesome presentations. They were super informative. Brian, I think we've got one more slide that we can pop up there. while Brian's getting that situated, basically this slide is in regards to the public input survey that is ongoing. It started live on January 4th and we'll have it live until February 2nd. We encourage everyone listening to, if you haven't already, to please take a moment and check it out and post any comments that you have about the study that was just presented. We will put the link to the survey in the chat for easy reference, but you can also find it on the project webpage, also on the Durant Nature Preserve website. And then also just to let you know, in case you had so much fun at this public meeting and you want to do another one, we will be having one on January 26th, same time, 6 to 7 p.m. If you have any friends or neighbors that you know would be interested in the project, please pass the word along and encourage them to attend that meeting as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to segue into our Q&A section of the meeting. And for that, I'm going to call on our technical expert, Michael, to just pop on and let us know how we're going to operate our Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. And for those attending the meeting, there's two different ways that we can communicate and you can ask your questions. One is by using the raise hand function, which will be in the lower, I believe, left hand of your phone or laptop. If you press that, it'll notify me and I can ask you to unmute yourself and we can go one at a time. And you can verbally ask your question or comment on the presentations. The other way is to use the chat function and just type in your question and we'll look through those and kind of give it to the board here to discuss and answer the questions that way. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise the hand button and I'll unmute you, or you can type it into the chat. All right, first one is from John Connors. John, you please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay.
We can.
Hi, Amy, Brian. I know some of these people here. I used to work as the city naturalist in 1979 to 1996, and I worked at Durant Nature Park, so I know the place pretty well. So I want to ask a question about sort of what happened to the upper lake, and maybe you can answer this. This is probably for Barbara or Kevin. In the 1980s, Beavers constructed a dam just above the upper lake, creating about a 3 to 4 acre beaver swamp. So this was above the 6 acre lake. And it was extraordinary habitat. It was really, really great. Sometime in the 1990s, there was a large storm which collapsed the sediment pond at a development just upstream of Durant. It sent this huge plug of sand and sediment, that's what you see, that came down and it literally filled in the beaver swamp. The beavers vacated the property, and honestly, the place, that area has never recovered from that episode. You'll notice, I mean, it's been 20 plus years. It's mostly still a grassy sand area, with a stream wandering through it. Every time a heavy storm event, the stream reconfigures itself. No floodplain forest has regrown in that area. So it's kind of curious. I mean, I'm curious about that. But when I look at the plans you have, I don't know which of those plans is actually going to, arrest that movement of sand and silt down. It's a huge amount of sand and silt there. And is that going to continue to come down with storm events and cover up whatever you put in?
I can, if you advance the slide ahead to the lake as is, and actually go to the next one, Brian, to the first wetland. Yes, so at the top, we've got this forebay. Yes, Perfect, Brian. That forebay is going to help with capturing some of that sediment. It provides a clean out space. And it's really sad to hear about the beavers because them, impounding kind of water above, they were really creating that forebay and creating an area for that material to drop out and kind of maintain some of the storage capacity of the lake. But what you're describing, John, is very common. I've heard that in urban environments with kind of the flashy urban hydrology, it can be really tough for beaver. Now, one thing I have seen is that sometimes structures like these labyrinth weirs we've shown actually facilitate beavers. So it's maybe they come back in on the upper part of this and it provides a kind of structural platform for them to build and they dam. And as long as elevations are such that it doesn't flood anybody upstream and that's tolerable, that may happen because a lot of times their dam is really blown out by that, just a really severe tropical storm. That we had that on our campus creek. We had some beaver and they were blown out during Hurricane Matthew. So without kind of that facilitating kind of some structural human help for them, that would not be uncommon. But again, that forebay is intended to kind of have that first pocket. So that's the kind of multi-cell you have more than one cell. So stopping some of it at the upper end so it doesn't continue all the way down.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
What about, is it possible to plant trees and stuff up there? Would that help stabilize those sands?
Well, this whole, everything that's shaded in here, except for the deep pools and that darker blue, is going to become vegetated. That's the intent with those emergent wetland plants. There will be some high areas that even like bald cypress or river birch or things could be planted on, but that emergent wetland vegetation is really going to trap a lot of sediment as well.
But I'm actually asking about above the 6-acre lake, like that zone above it is the part that's still unstable and trees are not colonizing it.
Yeah, so it's got a lot of active sediment removal. And we did not, design anything for above this kind of forebay reach.
Yes, right. Okay.
But Barbara, is it fair to say, or John, maybe we could talk about it that we're at the conceptual stage now. Go to actual schematic design after picking an option. You go far beyond what we've done to plan for concepts. You actually look at what's on the ground at a different level. So we could look at some of that and do a little bit more of a deep dive into sediment questions when we got to the next step. Is that fair to say, Kevin and Barbara?
Yes, and then even when you move to the, the actual design, you could add into the project, like once you decide what you want to do, maybe there's some stabilization and planting that you want to be addressed above even that forebay, if, depending on your property boundary.
I think John and Brian put forth some good ideas. I think, Barbara, one thing the report calls out is that any ongoing sedimentation of the lake looks like it's primarily from stream bed erosion, as opposed to historic sedimentation of the lake, which appears to have come from build out of the watershed and maybe in particular construction of I-540.
Yes, right. So that would be, some stabilization of channels above could be, very complementary to maintaining this, to getting at that a long-term viability goal.
And another addition here for those listening that may not have taken the survey yet and done the public input piece, I encourage you to do that. And also, even if you already have, it's nice to have John with us tonight. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm good.
Thanks for coming. Know that the comments that John made, he's also added. They're captured in the public input surveys. So if anybody want to go back and reference and get a little bit more idea of what he's talking about, he's provided that in writing as well.
And John, before moving on to some of the other questions that are now coming in, it was asked, how the lake had been used prior to the event that you described. Could you speak to that?
It was, of course, this was a Boy Scout facility, and the Boy Scouts had a dock up there, but it was gone by the time the city acquired it in 1979. So in terms of how we've used it, it was always, the concept, as Brian described early, was for this to be more of a refugia, so that with the heavier uses down in the lower lake, we had all these school kids out there, they still do, and they're catching all the tadpoles and aquatic insects and stuff from the lake. And we sort of had the refugia up here where those things would not be caught up there and would always be available to repopulate the lower lake if the lower lake was, let's say, over harvested. So that was the idea. The upper lake was going to protect the lower lake, the natural resources of the lower lake. But people fished in it, people hiked along the one side of it. It was always part of what we did and used. Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to another question that's come in is, will any of these plans result in a lower water level and increase the risk of mosquitoes or other pests? And I think Dr. Dole, you may be the best one to answer that.
Right, so if it's a healthy wetland and it's planted well and we get a lot of good emergent wetland plants, then you will get dragonflies, you will get amphibians, and these things, they eat mosquitoes. So you don't have an infestation of mosquitoes with that but you have to have to have the right water levels. So we would lower water levels. That shallow water zone would be about 6 inches deep. The deep pools would be, 2 to 3 feet deep. And then some of the small fish are called gambusia that would be in those pools, and they eat mosquitoes as well. Now, if you did a very poor wetland and you didn't have good soil in there and the plants don't thrive and you have the water levels wrong and it gets infested with cattails, then you could have a real mosquito problem on your hands. But I encourage you to maybe even go look at the wetland at Fred Fletcher Park that has an amazing diversity of wetland plants there, and it is not a mosquito problem in that wetland.
Thank you very much. Is there any follow-up questions to that one before moving on? Alrighty, so what measures can be made to prevent the damage due to development from occurring again or in other parts of the city?
I wrote a response there to that as well. Better erosion control and good stormwater management practices. So the well design, everything has to be designed right, installed right, and then maintained. So it's like there can be slippages all the way through that process. If it's it's just a poor design, it's going to be failing from the outset. But even a good design that's not constructed or maintained properly is not going to work. So those are the keys. We have to have the very best of erosion control and stormwater controls.
Thank you. And I think that also, speaking of maintenance, speaks to the question about the forebay needing to be dredged. And as maintenance, your answer to that, as I see you've included in the chat, is that it would need to be dredged every few years.
And that would be very dependent on, again, those eroding creeks or any development. that would, that would disturb soil and send soil down there. If your loads are very low, like the streams are in good condition and there's no active construction, they could go a long time where it would not need any dredging in that forebay.
Thank you.
Barbara, to that point, would you need dredging in any of the other options?
Pardon me?
Can you speak to whether or not dredging is part of the annual maintenance for any of the other options?
And Jack can chime in if we added that in the maintenance. I know it's in the 2 wetland cells, but I don't think so for the stream. That was why the stream restoration has the worst score on risk to the downstream lake, is because it would not capture, it would like let sediment come through and pass over to the downstream lake. So it's going to affect the storage of that, and just it's not going to provide, other than the water spreads out on the floodplain, it would not hold as much water back. So it kind of puts more flow pressure on the downstream lake in big flows. So it's primarily the forebay was designed on the wetland alternatives.
Thank you. Yeah, to John's earlier point, if you don't stabilize that sediment, that was one of the reasons that we scored the stream.
You could add a forebay or a structure on the lake as is if you kept it a lake, but you could add that structure there. I mean, we really included on the wetlands because you don't want your wetland just completely covered over with sediment if there was some type of, severe incident upstream.
So I know that we've got a hand raised. Before we move to that, we've got one in the chat that would you please comment on the impact of the existing hiking trails on the lakes now and the impact of the changes on the hiking trails currently surrounding the lakes?
Hey, Christy, I'll jump in on that. I just want to acknowledge that we definitely understand the importance of our hiking trails to our patrons. I know that's really high on the list for all of our visitors to have that access. So I actually don't foresee a whole lot of changes to the amount of hiking trails that we currently have. I can't say for certain that there wouldn't be some rerouting involved when all is said and done. But I do think this project also provides some potential for some additional enhancements, especially in terms of access with the potential for some boardwalks that would provide some really great opportunities for wildlife viewing and some features that we currently don't have. So I'm kind of excited about that.
Thank you, Amy.
I believe John Connors has another question. John, I think you're still unmuted, so feel free to ask your question.
Okay, yeah, so there's a tributary that actually comes into the 6-acre upper lake. It comes in from the south, and it looks like you're doing something there. Yeah, exactly, that spot. If you follow that tributary up to where it originates, there's a parcel of land, and although most of the watershed feeding this, the upper lake, as you have described, is developed, that particular tributary comes in from land that is, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of partially developed. It is mainly used for storing yard waste, big piles of dirt, piles of mulch. It used to be a place where they stored cars, dead cars, but I think now it's mostly just yard waste and stuff. But I'm sure at some point it's going to be developed. It's industrially zoned, so it may be developed pretty much like Lincoln Park North, which has had tremendous impact on the lower lake. So at some point in the future, I think there's going to be a lot of water coming down that tributary. And I'm not sure that the plan is going to address that. And my thinking, my personal thinking would be, it would be much better to address it closer to the source at the property line than actually trying to deal with it down at the lake. So I don't know if you've looked at that. I'm not even sure this is a question, but maybe Kevin and Barbara could think about that.
And yeah, and I had that in the PowerPoint, the one slide of that tributary that's coming in.
John, this is Kevin, and you're aware that that with development would come a requirement for stormwater controls, mostly applying to reduction of runoff of nutrients and reduction of peak runoff, such that it approximates the pre-development rate of runoff. But that there's still impacts downstream. If one thing I can speak to, we can't really address it until it's rezoned and about to be redeveloped. But with rezoning would come rezoning conditions potentially, either offered, usually offered by the developer, but in some way or another, part of the city's authorization for rezoning, that we could work with the developer to further reduce runoff and further reduce sedimentation from any new development. We're seeing a trend toward that being a condition of rezoning expected by the city.
Yeah, Brian, if you go to the lake as is slide,
Okay.
the lake as is slide, now click on that. Keep clicking. Oh, wait, no. Yeah, the lake, keep going. All right, this one. Right there, that photo on the left,
Right.
that's that tributary. See that photo over there on the left?
Mm-hmm.
That's the tributary you're referring to, John. It's very, what we call incised and eroding on that bottom end. Now, I don't know how far up that goes, but this is one, Jack, who's on the call, he and Kevin, maybe some others looked at this tributary. There was some interest in trying to stabilize this really highly erosive reach of that. Now, I think it's wise for with all these impoundments to look at the whole stream network to them. And if there's, really severe problems that may need to be coupled with investments in these lakes, that you go up and look at the network in that and make sure you've got the streams as stable as you can before big investments in that reservoir, right? To protect that investment.
That was my point. That's my point.
John, also on Lincoln Park North, we are working on that stream that comes to the lower lake, doing some restoration design work on that right now. We're also entering into a partnership with the owners of Lincoln Park North to upgrade an old stormwater control device that was installed many years ago, but the regulation of it was never made very clear in the early days of rezoning conditions of this type, and we're going to work with them to upgrade it to reduce the flows to the lower lake and also make it a better functioning for capturing pollutant and sediment.
I'll bet Amy's happy to hear that.
I'm ecstatic, John.
Partnership that we've had with stormwater and being able to address some of these longstanding issues. Fantastic, we really appreciate Kevin and his colleagues. And study's one example, but there's others that are moving us forward.
It looks like we have about 5 minutes left. So if there's anyone else online that'd like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat message box and we'll get those questions.
Well, Elizabeth asked one about commenting on the impact of the existing hiking trails on the lake now and the impact of the changes on the hiking trails currently surrounding the lakes. So I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that.
Amy actually touched on that just a few
Okay.
minutes ago. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
We support each other. So while people are reflecting on any additional questions that they might have, I just want to again point out that within the chat, you'll find a link to the survey so that you can participate in giving us not only your thoughts, but any additional feedback or things that pop up after this meeting is adjourned.
I don't see any hands raised as far from the attendees list, so I think we're good there.
All right, well, don't forget, the second meeting is January 26th from 6 to 7 p.m. The survey will be open until February 2nd. The link is in the chat. It's also available at the Durant Nature Preserve website, so you can find it multiple ways. We want to thank everyone so much for your participation tonight and for joining our panelists and for asking us such great questions. If anybody else has anything to say, I think we're ready to close out and wish everyone a good evening.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you all for joining us.